In this installment of the After the Collapse series, we're going to continue moving eastward in our exploration of how Canada might sustain the impacts of total grid-down societal collapse. Our discussion began about the myriad of consequences that might affect the West Coast. Then we moved into British Columbia, the Rocky Mountains, and the province of Alberta. In this installment of the series, we're going to look at the Great Plains that span the three provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and speculate about how this region of Canada might sustain the impacts of total societal collapse and the chaos that ensues thereafter. It should be noted that with the exception of the southernmost climates of the United States, much of this information will be universally applicable and relevant to Americans and people abroad. So let's get to it. Don't forget that you can simply show your support for this After the Collapse series by liking, commenting, and sharing this video on other social media platforms. Enjoy the video. The Canadian prairies, or the flatlands as they're commonly known, are a massive landscape spanning three provinces, Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Together they comprise 1.7 million square kilometers of the Canadian landmass, and yet only contain a population of 6 million people. This means that there are only on average 3 people per square kilometer, and the truth of the matter is that 90% of the population resides in the major urban centers of Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer, Fort McMurray, Regina, Saskatoon, and Winnipeg, in addition to a dozen odd other townships with populations under 100,000 people. The fact is, in 90% of this land, particularly in the northern parts, the population density is 1 person per hundreds of square kilometers. This seemingly limitless landscape is far removed from the warm Pacific air and the shelter of the obscure mountainous landscape of the Rocky Mountains, and it's even further still from the densely populated metropolis of the Great Lakes. This low population density means that in general terms, at least, there is less likely to be conflict within this region for resources. We'll discuss this in more depth later in the video. The environment of this region is characterized by endless skies, wild weather extremes, and a flat horizon that seems to go on forever and ever. By some people's standard, the Canadian prairies are the middle of nowhere, meaning it's either a survivalist paradise or a survivalist nightmare. This will depend on how acclimated you are to the environment, the skills you possess, your stockpile of preparedness goods, and your sheer tenacity and will to live. The main challenge for would-be post-collapse survivors within this region is going to be not freezing to death. One of the defining features of this landscape is the harsh climate, particularly the harsh winter climate. Nothing quite epitomizes the Canadian winter as icy cold winds blowing over a frigid prairie landscape. In a grid-down situation, only those with the knowledge of living off the land will survive here. The carrying capacity of these lands was low, even before the eradication of the 50 million buffalo that used to circulate this region. Without the means to fuel modern agricultural production levels, and without the great bison that once sustained the nomadic lifestyle of the Aboriginal people, the environment here can only support small amounts of people. In spite of the fact that a large amount of food is currently produced in this region, you must recognize that this relies heavily on fuel, the electrical grid, modern farming practices that require pesticides, and large-scale cultivation methods. There are 2 main factors to consider when it comes to assessing the post-collapse potential of any particular environment. One of those is resource availability, and the other is population density. This gives us a matrix of 4 general possibilities. One in which you can have high resource scarcity, and high population density, this would be one of the worst situations to be in, and one that will be characteristic of some of the major metropolises in North America in a grid-down situation. There's also low resource scarcity or resource abundance and high population density, which in spite of being an improvement over the first scenario, will still likely see a significant conflict for resources due to the high population density. You can also have resource scarcity and low population density. The best climate to typify this might be the Arctic climates, where you have very low populations, but it's because there's very little food to be had there. One of the most ideal situations would have to be one of resource abundance and low population density. Few places on Earth remain, with the exception of some national parks, that are going to offer this bounty of possibilities. Were it not for the harshly long winters of the prairie landscape, it might fall into this ideal category of resource abundance and low population density. Without a doubt, the number one killer in this region and in a shit hits the fan situation in Canada in general is going to be the cold. In the heart of the prairies in the province of Saskatchewan, particularly in the northern regions, it gets incredibly cold. And because it's such a wide open landscape with no mountains or hills to temper the cold, this climate will be a death sentence to many who don't have some self-sustaining way of keeping them and their family warm. Now, 2/3 of the landmass of these three prairie provinces is covered by the boreal forest, and as such in the wintertime, wood to keep your home warm would be plentiful, so long as you had a proper wood stove to combust it in. The problem is that the majority of the population live in the lower parts of the provinces, where the terrain is primarily prairie grassland, in which tree stands are incredibly sparse and in some places non-existent for hundreds of kilometers. Enduring a winter in these regions without proper rationing of your fuel would mean certain death. It was the manure, or buffalo chips as they're commonly called, of the great bison that allowed the Native American populations to exist in this region in wintertime. This is another reason why that in the absence of the 50 million buffalo that once roamed this region, survival here without modern technology is nearly impossible for any sizable amount of people. Without an electrical grid to regulate the flow of natural gas to Canadian homes, life simply would not be sustainable here. Another useful resource for Canadian preppers and survivalists are Crown land and designated area maps. Most provinces make these maps available online. They are distinct from road maps and topographical maps. They don't contain topographical information, but they will provide you with vital information that not only can help you deliberate an ideal bug-out location, but are also useful for general hunting, camping, and recreational purposes. These maps offer information such as protected wildlife areas, historical parks, migratory bird sanctuaries, game preserves, Indian reservations, agriculture and resource crown land, community pastures, and wildlife refuges. This information will prove very useful in a grid-down situation, as it will reflect the availability of resources in a given region. We see some of the most wildest extremes in this province, with some of the warmest temperatures ever recorded, contrasted with some of the coldest ever recorded. In the summertime, the prairies tend to be hot and muggy. So although the growing season is short, you can still grow many staple crops here, including staple crops like wheat, sunflower seeds, canola, beans, and barley. Another very nutrient-dense crop which is grown in Saskatchewan in large amounts is lentils. Hemp is another commodity which is grown in this region, and of course, hemp can be used for a variety of things that are both constructional and edible in nature. Hemp seed provides an incredible amount of micronutrients and proteins, and the fibers from the hemp itself can be used to make anything from clothing to paper to building supplies to rope, even fuel. If one were so inclined, they could engineer ethanol. However, this might be too lengthy a process that isn't going to be worth the energy invested unless it was done on a massive scale. Wild edibles such as Saskatoon berries and other perennial fruits would be available for last-ditch sustenance, but should not be relied on as an ongoing source of food, unless done so horticulturally. The production of produce within greenhouses is also commonplace across Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and in certain parts of the province of Saskatchewan, like the Qu'Appelle Valley, the production of typical garden produce is quite common. However, most of the arable land across these provinces is used to grow grain. The abundance of wetlands across these provinces offer plentiful hunting opportunities for various waterfowl like geese and duck. To get a sense of what type of plants can be grown in any particular region, a good resource for reference is the Plant Hardiness Zone map. Although not to be solely relied on for the ideal crops for a given region, this can be a very useful tool in determining what to expect in terms of the suitability of certain landscapes for certain crops. When we discuss Alberta's disproportionately large cattle population compared to the rest of the Canadian population, remember they have 35% of all cattle in Alberta, while Manitoba and Saskatchewan combined don't fall too far behind from that, with 3.5 million head of cattle, as well as millions upon millions of chickens. These domesticated livestock, of course, will sustain the farming communities that raise them. It's very likely that these farms are going to be the targets of theft, and in the worst case scenario, in a full-blown collapse of law and order as we know it, these farms, if not properly defended, will be overthrown by roving gangs, or may have their farms extorted by whoever emerges as the post-collapse local authority of that region. Fishing will be abundant in this region, especially in wintertime. Ice fishing will be a means to sustain yourself. A ballpark estimate based on Saskatchewan wildlife statistics is that in some regions there are 1 to 3 large game animals per square kilometer. It is often presumed that many of these animals will be hunted to extinction if the shit were to ever hit the fan. They certainly are likely to be wiped out where people are present. However, in the northern parts of the provinces where it's impossible to really travel into deep by foot or even vehicle in some instances, many of these animals will find refuge there, so I doubt they will ever fully go extinct. This really will depend on how far human beings are willing to press into the forest to chase after these animals. Realistically, this is not a sustainable nomadic lifestyle. Without the buffalo, this sort of primitive nomadism is not practical. Another factor that I'm going to introduce into the discussion is the cannibalism factor. You may recall I delved extensively into the topic of cannibalism last year in an After the Collapse installment. Based on that analysis, I will be providing regional likelihoods of cannibalistic activity. Now, in spite of the relative abundance of wild game and domesticated livestock that's available for people to consume, post-collapse, in a very protracted long-term grid-down situation, I believe that cannibalism within these regions will be very likely. Now, I base this speculation on the fact that in the urban environments of the prairies, there are a lot of people who have grown very dependent on eating meat. Veganism is not a popular thing down here. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that it's going to be much harder for a vegan to make the necessary moral concessions needed to devolve into the act of cannibalism than people who practice a carnivorous diet. Furthermore, due to the long and brutally cold winters and the lack of fuel available in the prairies, I find it hard to believe that people are going to have the energy to venture out further and further to procure wild game, even if it is only ice fishing. Many people won't have the skill sets necessary to do so. In spite of the fact that many people either themselves have knowledge of how to hunt and fish, or in the very least know somebody who does, there are still many people who do not. And as such, I can foresee numerous scenarios in which people are struggling to stay warm and simply do not have the energy to venture out to procure the food that they need for sustenance, and instead perhaps may turn to the corpses of those who have passed on and whose bodies have been frozen and preserved by the winter, similar to the case in 1972 in the Andes Mountains, where the survivors of a plane crash were forced to eat the frozen corpses of those who had previously passed on. I think it's safe to say that in some rare and desperate circumstances, people may resort to cannibalistic activity to survive. Now, the longer that the collapse goes on and the more accustomed people become to eating human flesh, the increased likelihood that people will go one step further and actually proactively murdering each other in order to survive. Now, skepticism of such activity is warranted because cannibalism in Western society, and rightly so, is viewed as extremely repugnant. But you must remember that at our core, human beings are animals. No matter how sophisticated our culture has evolved to become, nor how refined our tastes or clean and whitewashed our demeanor, in my personal opinion, cannibalism on the Canadian prairie is not something that should be taken lightly or even jokingly, because it could very well be a very serious decision that you and your family have to make, or it's going to pose a significant security risk for you. When the food runs out, no matter where you are, you must remember what we are, and we are at our core animals. Stay tuned for the second half of this Prairies After the Collapse installment, which should be out in a few days. And don't forget, you can show your support for the After the Collapse series by donating via PayPal. All of the donations I receive go into making more audiovisually engaging videos. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.